Welcome to the previews of Thunder Junction. Today, my favorite is this Mad Lad Breaches, because his mechanical flavor is on point. He's a Chaos Goblin and you get to give him an artifact and he'll see what he'll do with it. Either having you copy the spell or dealing damage equal to its mana value. And the outcomes of the two are usually so different that you might be worked against by Breaches, but that's the way he wants it to be. Next up, we have the Cycle of Life. Starting with the Omen Port Vigilante, because this one shows us a little bit more about Free Striders. These are a group of maybe saviors or heroes, you might say. Here we see two flavor texts of them. The Free Striders believe in liberation in all its many forms, which isn't very on color, but seems fun. Definitely on the cowboy plane, maybe that is the way in which you will be good by bringing freedom. And Free Striders took to patrolling near the Omen Paths, protecting new arrivals from the robbers and charlatans, prowling for easy marks. And I think that's pretty metal. In a world where crime is normal, maybe you should go against that, and maybe that is the real crime of the day. Next up we have another group which someone really important is shown today, because we have the Slick Shots, and the leader, it seems, of them is Lila, or at least she hasn't lost to any other Slick Shots. And I think that's because she uses these whip-like magic strings. She is a 3-mana 3/3 with Prowess, very useful for a Spellslinger leader. And she says, whenever you cast a multicolor instant or sorcery spell from your hand, exile it instead of putting it into your graveyard as it resolves. If you do, it becomes plotted. Note that when it becomes plotted, you don't really get a copy of it. You get to cast the spell again, and that does mean that you can put it into or plot it once more. So you can keep doing that, and I think that is really strong, and she has to be dealt with, which is fun. Next up we have the Dug Up Gems. This one isn't as expensive as the previous ones, but still $19. Archangel of Tithes. 4 mana for a mythic, a 3/5 with flying, which is not as important anymore today, but as long as it is untapped, creatures can't attack you or planeswalkers you control, unless your opponents pay 1 mana for each of those creatures, so it protects you. And then when it's attacking, they can't block for the same reason as well. So it also helps you get in. If your opponent is tapped out, you can easily get in with all of your creatures, of course. Onto the other mythics, like Goldvein Hydra, which is very strong in my opinion. It's a Hydra, so it has an X cost, in this case green and X, where the X will be its power and toughness, because it will get that many +1 counters on it. Then it has vigilance, trample and haste, so it is a really good attacker and will help you block anyways. And then when it dies, you create a number of tapped treasure tokens equal to its power, so pumping it up just before it dies does also help in the way that you get more treasures. So I think there is a really fun deck to be found in here. The treasures do enter tapped, so it isn't like going infinite right away, but it is still a very strong card and will, I think, definitely see some play in standard and change some things around there. Next up is Assimilation Aegis, which is a 3-mana exile ability that exiles the creature under this artifact. Then it says when it becomes attached to a creature with its equip ability, for as long as it remains attached, that creature becomes a copy of the card that you exiled with it. So if you exile a really important creature from your opponent, or maybe from your side, you can make other creatures on your side become just as strong, or even stronger depending on the circumstance. Next up we have a really cool commander, or it should go in all of your token decks that are Naya colored, which are all of your token decks probably. It's a 3-mana 3/3 with haste, and says non-token creatures like red have tapped to create a token that's a copy of another target token you control that entered the battlefield this turn. So that is a need there, but Once you have one of those tokens enter the battlefield this turn, like a 4/4 green rhino with a trample, for example, you can tap all of your other creatures that are non-token to create new copies of that new token as well. So easily you will be able to get like 20 of those tokens, right? The flavor is also pretty fun because, of course, Gret's from Ravnica and he has been with the Gruul and the Selesnya, but on this world he has found real freedom, and I love that for him. Next up is the 1 of 8 segment, where I look at 2 cards this time that might go into some competitive decks in Pro Tour and stuff. And one of them, or well, not the Pro Tour, but in competitive decks, one of them is an uncommon, Requisition Raid. It's a 1 mana spree card that I value highly for the go wide strategies that are really popular right now with Boros, for example. Because it is a 2 mana, essentially sorcery that says put a +1 counter on each creature target player controls. You can target yourself, and that also means that you have another way to give all of your small creatures an extra power, and I think that's the most important part there. But it can also be a destruction spell for artifacts and enchantments. So I think this is really versatile and it does help with your overall game plan. Next up is the Rush of Dread, which is a rare, so a big increase in rarity. But I think this is really good for the control decks, because with this card you can have your opponents discard half the cards in their hand and sacrifice half the creatures they control, so that is really versatile as well. It does weaken them and they get to choose, so it doesn't really defeat them right away, but it also says target opponent loses half their life rounded up, so in many decks this can really at least chunk your opponent down. Next up we have some ongoing narratives with also some good cards. On top of that, Ariad the Beguiler of course returns one of the villains. We will be going over these villains in another video, so all of the villains that are part of Oko's team. She says, whenever an aura you control becomes attached to a non-land permanent an opponent controls with mana value less than or equal to that aura's mana value, you get to steal those creatures. Of course you can strengthen them, but that's a little bit dangerous, because of course you do get to grow the creatures, but how will they get them back? So I think this is a really strong one, and definitely a fun contender for some commander things where you want to cast really expensive auras on your opponent's creatures to gain control of them. It seems fun and a little bit mean. Next up, ongoing narratives is showing the Vengeful Townsfolk, which is a 3/3 for 3 mana. This is whenever one or more creatures you control die, put a +1 counter on it. And this is a ongoing narrative, not necessarily for a character, but because the Unruly Mob and cards like it have returned a lot of times. These are just a group of humans, usually, that are angry at something else. Maybe wolves, maybe angels, maybe a company, and they get stronger whenever another creature dies, because they get angry. Next up is Karvek the Punisher, who returns another character, of course. This one is also a really strong one. It says whenever you commit a crime, so when you target something from your opponents or your opponents, you exile up to 1 target black card from your graveyard and copy it. You may cast a copy, and if you do, you lose 2 life. So losing 2 life, sure, but you do get to cast a lot of spells from your graveyard that might also commit more crimes for you. So this is definitely something that can help you go off. You do have to still cast the copies, but it's still helping you get a lot of value. Next up is Obeka or Obika, I'm not really sure, but I think Obeka, Splitter of Seconds, who came from an already pretty metal card, which said to tap the player whose turn it is may end the turn. But Obeka, the Splitter of Seconds, is even cooler, I would say, because when she gets in, so when she deals combat damage to a player, you get that many additional upkeep steps after this phase. So you do need to get in with her, but then you get a really weird thing where you get multiple upkeeps after that, so probably 2 if she gets in directly. You do need to get a way to get in with the damage, but then it is a really cool way to build a commander, and I would say this will be played a lot, or at least people will try. Next up is the reanimation spell that is, I think, strongest in the set up to this point. Rakdos jumps up. That would be fun, sort of drum and bass. But joins up 5 mana for an enchantment, and when it enters the battlefield, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield with 2+1 counters on it, so that's already stronger than some other 5 mana recursion spells. And it says when a legendary creature you control dies, Rakdos deals damage equal to that creature's power to target opponent. So sacrificing the big creatures that you already want to sacrifice with Rakdos the card himself also lets you deal damage equal to its power, so you're definitely slaying those creatures. Next up, very sleeve worthy, is Roxanne Starfall Savant, because for 5 mana you get a Cat Druid, a 4/3, but more importantly, when she enters the battlefield or attacks, you create a meteorite. And these say when they enter the battlefield, they shock, and you can tap them for 1 mana of any color. But Roxanne also says, and this is maybe even the best kicker, when you tap an artifact token for mana, like the meteorites, but also all of your other ones, you add 1 mana of any type that artifact token produced. So this is definitely all about that mana creation, but whatever you do with it might be strong. Next up, another round. This is a sorcery that lets you exile any number of creatures you control and return them for their enter the battlefield effects, probably, because this is a sorcery, not really a protection spell. Then you repeat the process X more times, where X is paid in your mana cost. So for 3 mana it's once, for 5 it's twice, and for 7, for example, it's 3 times. But the fact that you do get to blink your creatures that probably have strong enter the battlefield effects in your deck multiple times, I think is really cool and makes this really flexible. Also, the flavor is really cool, that there is a sort of pub or an inn that where the doors open up randomly whenever someone needs it on this plane, and I think that is really beautiful. We do yet have to see it, but that seems legendary. Next up is One Last Job, which is a 3 mana spree card that lets you, well, it's maybe an even stronger reanimation spell. So maybe this one is the strongest we've seen up to this point. But this is 5 mana to return a creature, then +1 mana to return a mount, which is also a creature, or a vehicle card from your graveyard to the battlefield, both. And then another to the battlefield return effect for an aura or equipment for 1 extra mana. That's really, I think, insane. The equipment also gets attached to a creature you control, so for 4 mana you have that weird effect where you can put a really expensive equipment on one of your creatures. So I think this one is really interesting for the equipment decks that might spring out of this. Next up is a really, I think, flavorful one for the Rakdos scholars. It's a 3 mana Lizard Rogue. Lizards also, by the way, will be in Bloomborough, so this is also a card that might be strong for that archetype. This one says creatures you don't control, but don't own are mercenaries in addition to their other types, meaning that they are outlaws. At the beginning of your upkeep, you exile the top X cards of your target's opponent's library, where X is the number of outlaws you control. Until end of turn, you may cast spells from among them, and mana of any type can be spent to cast those spells. So you will steal more and more from your opponents, and you will play more and more from your opponents to steal more and more from your opponents. Calamity Galloping Inferno is a 6 mana mount. It has haste, and just saddle 1, so it's not really expensive. But when you attack it while saddled, you choose a non-legendary creature that settled it this turn and create a tapped and attacking token that's a copy of it. You sacrifice the token at the beginning of your next end step, and you repeat the process once. So instead of attacking with the creature once, you get to attack with 2 tokens that you don't care, where you don't care when they die. And also you will have 3 of the creatures on the battlefield, so any ongoing effects they have will be tripled for that short moment in battle, until you need to sacrifice the tokens at your end step. Reckless Lackey is a card that will be good in limited, I would say, draft, because, and maybe a little bit in standard actually, because it is a 1 mana first strike haste creature, which are really good in the mono red decks at this moment. And it says for 3 mana you can sacrifice it to draw a card, which is a little bit slow, but for limited play really good. And it is a common, so I think this will put the red decks in a very aggressive stance, of course. And we have Discerning Peddler, which I mostly wanted to show actually for the flavor, because I think it is fun that we can see how many worlds are coming together, like the Fioran cookware that she sells and the Naktamun herbs. Other than that, it is just a 2 mana 2/2 common that also says draw a card and discard a card, and if you do, you may draw a card, which is always good in draft. Last one, which is also basically for the flavor, because it says the Atin are delight in delving into the unique wonders of each world they visit. So this seems like a group of people that delight in the wonders of each world, going around them and maybe saving nature, and I think that is really cute. Next up is another theme, which is Blast from the Future. Like the lizard we saw from before, rabbits will also return in Bloomburrow. So this one might tell us a little bit more about the mechanics of those. Where the lizards were like stealing people. The Rabbit Mercenary is a 3 mana 3/3 with Vigilance. And it says when it enters the battlefield, if an opponent controls more lands than you, you may search your library for planes and put it onto the battlefield tapped. So that's really strong for white as well. Then if an opponent controls more lands than you, repeat this process once. So you get to get 2 planes out of your library if you have a less amount of lands still. If you search your library this way, shuffle. So two land cards for white for 3 mana, that can be really strong. You do need to be a little bit behind on lands, but that's not even that hard. It needs to be an opponent as well. So in Commander, this also means that you just need 1 opponent to be 2 lands ahead. Yes. Maybe the rabbits will be about landfall, and that is a possibility because they are in green-white. So could be. Next up is the squirrel, the prairie dog. Not a dog, it's a squirrel. A 2 mana 2/2 that will also return as an archetype in Bloomburrow, the squirrels. It has lifelink, could show a little bit, maybe mean that they are about life gain. Then it says at the beginning of your end step, if you haven't cast a spell from your hand this turn, put a +1 counter on Prairie Dog. This sort of seems to mean to me that the scrolls will be about, in a way, ninjutsuing them onto the battlefield. That's my take on it. Also for 5 mana, which will help you, an activated ability of 5 mana will help you not cast any spells. Until end of turn, if you would put 1 or more +1 counters on the creature you control, put that many +1 on it instead. So a strong effect, as we know, but 5 mana to activate it is a little bit harsh. Does mean that you get, of course, an extra +1 counter from the Prairie Dog itself. So with multiple, maybe this is pretty strong. Last but not least, we have Mechanical, which is one of my favorites actually. These Rodeo Pyromancers say whenever you cast your first spell each turn, add 2 mana. Doesn't seem mechanical because it's not about a new mechanic that is shown here, but it does work really well with the cast 2 spells thing. And because this one says whenever you cast your first spell, you get extra mana with which you can pay your second spell. And that was it for today. Let me know what your favorite card is. Like always, thank you for watching. Bye. Release me, release my magic cards, cause the previous set was only 2 months ago.